Do you want to test it quickly?
Okay, shall I? Is this yours? Okay, I just move it in 1 second. I think. Yeah, I just move it here. So, good evening. Good evening. Well, I think it's this one. So, good evening, dear students, dear colleagues, and dear friends. It is our pleasure to welcome you, and it is our honor to welcome Mireille, Nelson, and Sarah to Frankfurt. Let me first start with thanking the many hands that have actually worked in realizing this 2 days event. First, I would like to thank Leon Bijan Kiansat, there you are, for coming up with the idea to commemorate 100 years Fanon. Thank you also to Heike Reifkens for supporting us in making this idea material. Thank you also to Yolima Vargas, project coordinator of House of Resources of the region Rhine-Main, that has liaised us and supported our cooperation with Brasil Ile, a German-Brazilian cultural association. And I'd like to thank Ana Gracia Correa-Witkowski and Betania Ramos-Schroeder. Thank you also to our colleagues Pilar Mendoza for supporting this event with a film series, and Leila Whitley for joining us in the teaching team in the course on Fanon that is taking place. We would also like to thank Black Power Frankfurt, Hands of Africa, and All African People Revolutionary Party for contributing in the workshops and inviting us to think with them. We would also like to thank Mohammed, that is very busy doing the technique, and also the photographers and other colleagues supporting us, and Leon will say more about that. And we would also like to thank the Freunde and Förderer, the friends and promoters of the Goethe University, for their support. I would also like to thank my team, Maria Cardenas, Slaja Brankovic, Vera Roja, Benisa Lopez Rodriguez, for their steady support. The title of our conference is 100 Years Frantz Fanon, Reflections on the Contemporary. When we started to think about the idea of commemorating Fanon in Frankfurt, we were intrigued by the question of how Fanon's work still influences our ways of seeing, analyzing, and conceptualizing the modern colonial present. Reading Fanon as a philosopher, psychoanalyst, sociologist, and activist invites us to a thorough understanding of how systems of oppression, such as colonialism and racism and capitalism, organize modern societies today. How subjects are produced under conditions of, as we say in German, Entrechtung, or dehumanization, but also how domination works through compliance, prestige building, and silence. How colonialism as a system of oppression works within a matrix of violence, and how colonial violence is prolonged in modern democratic societies, operating at the juncture of social reproduction and systemic destruction. It is here that questions related to Fanonian analysis of colonialism, racism, and fascism become relevant for the analysis of contemporary societies. Thus, how to understand the rapid delegitimation of human rights, of international law protecting those rights, the normalization of systemic killing in wars and genocides, the attacks on sovereign nations and democratic society, is actually the background on which we go here back to Fanon and ask the relevance of his thinking for analyzing these dimensions and dynamics. So we need to ask a lot of questions, and I will stop here. If we look at the news, we see constantly things happening that are not normal. Like, for example, the Ausländerbehörde, the office of foreigners now double-checking if you married a person from abroad, if this is right. But we see also the attacks at Venezuela, for example, the oil tank that has been seized in their territories. We see the situation in Gaza and the continuation of refusing human support or human rights support. So we have a lot of different questions that we will ask during this conversation, and I pass it on to Leon.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed at the moment because Mirel and Nelson and I got into a car accident like 20 minutes ago. Everything is fine, but still I think this adds to my nervousness that I'm feeling at this moment. But I'm very excited for this evening. And I'm very excited to hear from Mirel and Nelson and Sarah, of course, and to then engage in a conversation with all of you who came. So I'm very grateful for everyone who is in attendance tonight and who's going to participate tomorrow. Again, I want to thank the people who made this event possible, all of you who are contributing your labor and helping us on the administrative side. And I also quickly want to say that if we're reflecting with Fanon on the contemporary, then this is also a moment for us to reflect on the contemporary situation of us as an anti-colonial movement in Frankfurt and at Goethe University. This event would not be possible without our movement and our organizations, particularly Pan-African and Afro-diasporic organizations that are the backbone of the resistance to the dehumanization that Encarnacion has already spoken about. And I think it is this what maybe brings us into the tradition of Fanon, of which we will hear and listen and learn today, that all we do must be at the intersection of both producing knowledge and teaching knowledge and acquiring knowledge and making that knowledge available within our movements and organizations and communities. So I'm very grateful to see many of you here today who I understand as my comrades and friends. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it off to Ana Gracia and Betania.
Guten Abend. Ich möchte ihr nicht zumuten, mein Englisch, das wird sowieso keiner verstehen. Ana Gracia Correia Witkowski, ich komme aus Salvador de Bahia. Ich weiß, dass die Mirel Fanon auch dort gewesen ist, in Salvador, weil auch in Brasilien feiert man 100 Jahre von Fanon. 100 Jahre später haben wir Grund genug zum Feiern, aber auch Grund genug zum Sorgen und zu machen in dieser Gesellschaft. Und unser Verein Brasilien, wir arbeiten mit meiner Schwester da, Betania. Es geht bei uns um Thema Nachhaltigkeit, Frauengesundheit. Wir trennen einfach diese Themen nicht. Das ist sehr wichtig. Wir freuen uns, Teil zu sein von diesem Projekt. Ich hätte mir gewünscht, dass mehr schwarze Menschen hier im Raum, ich fühle mich mehr sicher, wenn mehr Leute, schwarze Menschen da sind, aber vielleicht seid ihr Multiplikatoren dabei und laden mehr die Leute ein. Auch irgendwann, vielleicht sind auch die Menschen, die nicht Zugang zur Universität. Vielleicht können sie auch mal über Fanon lernen und sich damit befreien. Schönen Abend dann.
We will continue with the conversation now, and our first speaker is Mireille Fanon-Mendes-France. Mireille. And Mireille Fanon-Mendes-France is a chairperson of the Frantz Fanon Foundation, member of the Scientific Council of Attac France, and ex-chair of the Working Group of People of African Descent. She has worked as professor at different levels of national education at UNESCO and as legal advisor at the French National Assembly. Mendes-France has been teaching also at Paris Descartes.
good evening. Guten Abend. Ich habe gelernt Deutsch when I was younger. First of all, I would like to thank Lyon, Incarnation, and your team to invite us with my co-chair, because I am not anymore chair, I am co-chair now with Nelson. And all the young people coming, students or friends and whatever. Thank you to be there. And that's true, I was in Brazil some days ago, and particularly in Salvador de Bahia, where I met wonderful people, Afro-Brazilian people. And I have to just say something very curious concerning Fanon. Fanon is quite new in Brazil. And the Brazil is the most important, in Brazil there is the most important population of Afro descendants. And I don't know why, but Fanon is not really well known. And it's really, if they know him, it's very new. Fanon's work arrived in Brazil around 990, not before. It is really strange. And I think as a professor or student, we have to pay attention to that. How in such country, big country, where the Afro-Brazilian are are the majority, Fanon is not really well known. And I think we have to do something in this perspective, because Afro-Brazilian are really demanding to know better Fanon's work. I will read in English for two reasons, because English is not my mother tongue, and the other reason is my mind is going so fast. Sometimes when I speak in English, I jump another idea for idea, and I forgot the sense of my presentation. Therefore, I prefer to read it, and I apologize for that. Given the current international context and the centenary of Frantz Fanon's birth, I will begin with one of his quotes, coming from the International Journal of the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital. It is a French hospital, psychiatric hospital, where my father was interned. I don't know how you translate in English. Not really doctor, but coming very soon doctor. The name of this journal is Trait d'Union, and it's from 1953. I quote, "One of the most difficult things for a man, as for a country, is to keep the three elements of time constantly in view: the past, the present, and the future. To keep these three elements in view is to recognize the great importance of expectation, hope, and the future. It means knowing that our actions yesterday may have consequences in 10 years' time, and therefore that we may have to justify those actions, and the need for memory in order to achieve this union of past, present, and future. However, memory must not predominate in man. Memory is often the mother of tradition. While it is good to have tradition, it is also good to go beyond tradition, to invent new ways of living. Those who consider the present to be worthless and believe that only the past should interest us are, in a sense, people who are missing two dimensions and cannot be relied upon. Those who believe that we should live life to the fullest right now and not worry about tomorrow or yesterday can be dangerous, because they believe that each minute is separate from the minutes that follow or precede it, and that they are the only ones on this earth, unquote. And you understand to who I refer, I suppose. This sentence caught my attention, particularly the last one, which reflects the way some presidents or prime ministers are currently behaving towards the people. We are all experiencing this danger, among other things, because our reality is confronted with the lies of impostors, giving vent to their rage and desire for revenge. Through the prism of their lies, their narcissistic flaws, and the danger that this entails, people are cast in a glassy farce. Are we living in a world bound by the killing, invisibilization, silencing, and ethnic cleansing? What is the most important is to consolidate their dream of power and need of profit, driven by the financialization of non-being's life. To that point, that can we see in their race for profits, a form of sexualization, always more, always higher to satisfy the need for possession that can only be achieved through the destruction of the other, since currently the other is considered the one limiting ecstasy to fully enjoy profit and possession. The other demands equality, recognition, attention, reparation, social justice, social peace, and even sharing and redistribution. And it is impossible to understand and to listen that and to accept that for those who want possess and dominated. Thus, acquiring always more and more is not enough. The pinnacle of possession and sublimation would be to be part of a privileged circle, just the elected people. Financially speaking, but also land speaking, finally, right of those people who stand in their way and will remind to those transgressing the sense of humanity. There is an ethic of political life that those identifying themselves as being must confront if they want to be perceived as human. Doing that, they break expectation, hope, and the future. And it is what used to do those currently governing in the name of their immediate ecstasy to dominate by financing all aspects of life and profiting of. Could we say their pleasure is more a work of destruction than the emergence of what could make every human human? Faced with this pleasure engendered by the racist liberal capitalist ideology, people watch, consumed by immeasurable shame in the face of universality, as the ethnic cleansing in Gaza continue with that in the West Bank. What will be the nature of the collective unconscious if the crazy and extremely violent dream of the President of the United States to transform Gaza into a Riviera comes true? But did not he have the same kind of project with Haiti? When he said that, I quote, "Soon someone will buy Haiti, Haiti is for sale," unquote. And what is his deal for Ukraine? When bombs fall on Gaza, do Israeli politicians think that counting the dead, the genocide offered by the Israeli state to the rest of the world, act as a catharsis and recognition of their rights? Is not it rather like imprisoning many of its supporters in the fantasy of an object of desire, which, once a crime has been committed, throws them into irreparable dehumanization? Afterwards, nothing will be possible. With this genocide, the Israeli state has revealed before our eyes, with our silence during the first 15,000 deaths, the conceptualization of a false truth. It is indeed a war of extermination in the sense in which Raphael Lemkin underlines it, I quote, an act of genocide directed against a national group as an entity, and the act in question are directed against individuals, not as individuals, but as members of their national groups, unquote. But all Israelis allies, led by the US, object to the use of this word. The state of Israel has the right to defend itself. Struggle for democracy against barbarism, whatever the price to pay in terms of dignity and fundamental rights, including the right to life. The victim and or their descendants with Jewish culture of the genocide perpetrated during the World War II have become the executioner of a people who have always lived in this land, as have all those who helped perpetrate this crime by refusing to pull certain political levers at the international community level. It took nearly 35,000 Palestinian deaths for some states to regain a little of their human dignity. With more than 80,000 deaths, European states are waking up, campaigning they want to recognize the state of Israel. Are they hoping for the umpteenth time to escape their shared responsibility for this genocide when they have a history of colonial crimes for which they have been granted legal impunity thanks to a perfectly colonial denial of justice? And we could see until today how this denial of justice is always applied when it concerns black bodies. Why, in the face of this disaster for humanity, our country unhesitatingly helping the state of Israel by providing it with military or financial aid? We must not ignore the fact that by helping or assisting this country, by recognizing its right to defend itself when it is the occupier, these countries are engaging their state's international responsibility and becoming complicit in illegal occupation, colonization, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the territory where Bedouins live under Israeli jurisdiction. It is sufficient for a third state to provide voluntary assistance in the commission of an illicit act or in the prolongation of that act. And this applies to all states that encourage, among other things, their company to sign contract for the sale of component or weapon to the Israeli state. It should be noted that in the case of the Palestinian people and in relation to Israel's internationally unlawful act, the obligations at stake are considered essential for the international community as a whole. If we do not want to jeopardize their colonialist aims, seek to eliminate an entire people from their land. No human can support their state if it helps to commit in a planned and systematic manner war crimes and genocide. No human should look away from the heaps of bodies beneath the rubble, nor should he refuse to see the inhumanity of a world that claims to uphold democracy and human rights when looking into the eyes of children ravaged by famine and actually rain and cold. But is it too late? Gaza is dying. Gaza is being bombed to death. while at the UN General Assembly, some states are recognizing Palestine as a state, even as they continue to supply weapons to the genocidal state. Yes, it is in this space of death that Palestine is today. Its people, designated as a common enemy fabricated by the thriller of Eurocentric racist white democracy, that the factory of deadly pleasure is played out. Death as an end in itself, death imposed on dissenters, death as a mode of governance. It is this pleasure that we must talk about, finding pleasure, ecstasy in death, more precisely, finding pleasure in imposing death on a targeted population. Is it not simply imposing death on oneself and, above all, depriving oneself in the long run of any desire for the other, of any hope, of any future, of any expectation? It is to condemn oneself endlessly to being one's own executioner and to satisfy one's desire, not with the other, but against the other. Is this not condemning oneself to roam endlessly across lands that will never be yours, and to be constantly the guardian of oneself while losing one's status as a victim? So easy to brandish when one's decisions are contested or even questionable. After that, who will believe you? Who will still believe in your word? With the Israeli state and all its supporters, it is its relationship to the world, and particularly to this world, wallowing in vulgarity of thought, wallowing in its decadent and pernicious whiteness, that must be analyzed. In this factory of deadly ecstasy, pleasure, it is not Hamas that should be questioned, but a state that has lost all sense of proportion to the point of forgetting that it helped build Hamas, aid in this endeavor by the North American, and that after enjoying its blow to the Achilles heel of the Palestinian Authority, is now organizing in an orgy it imagines to be the salvation of October 7. The genocide of Palestinians, without forgetting that this pleasure will only cease when the plan for the definitive expulsion of all Palestinians will be realized. And we can see what happened now with the 700 violation of the ceasefire. We must not forget. If in the UN Charter, the right of an aggressed state to defend itself, I refer to Article 51 from the UN Charter, could we confirm Israel was aggressed? The right to use disproportionate force is not recognized, as it is currently the case with the colonizing state, Israel. The principle of proportionality introduces the fact that an action must not be more devastating than the damage already suffered. However, in its response, the State of Israel has opted for indiscriminate violence, violating the principle of proportionality and acting illegally, since it does not respect any balance between the objective to save the hostage and the means employed, which are aimed solely at rendering Gaza uninhabitable for all Palestinians. The objective, to eliminate as many of them as possible, no matter if hostages are sacrificed in the process. Hamas must be ended in the name of their democracy, and many states follow them in these slaughters. What then authorizes the state to disregard the principle of proportionality by violating the rule and principle of war? Does not the notion of principle only cover the need to optimize values and interest, whereas norms and rules are often presented as ontological, logical, or methodological in nature? Does not the principle of proportionality take precedence over the rule and the norm, especially when a prime minister asserts that Hamas must be brought to an end and in return receive the backing of the entire international community, and particularly of his supporters who, like him, stand up against barbarity. It is then easy for him to decide on the quota of this proportionality. And it's at this point that we must question the role played by a number of Western states in their inability to think of the war waged against Palestine since the forced creation of the State of Israel, as anything other than the price to be paid for the crimes committed by whites against other whites with Jewish religion. This culpabilization has become a principle, a rule, a norm that is sometimes worse than use cogence, to the point where those who claim it have lost the meaning of words, deliberately confusing inter alia anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. On the part of many Western countries, there is a blatant willingness to lie, to falsify narrative, to be complicit in the commission of unspeakable crimes. No word will ever be able to describe this genocide, which carries with it all the duplicity, arrogance, and vengeance and inhumanity of the white world, which feels treated everywhere by the emergence of those it has invisibilized, killed, and silenced, regarding them as non-beings who are now claiming for dignity, humanity, and accountability. The aim is to eradicate the breeding ground for Palestinian militancy in Middle Eastern countries and to end the statute of many Palestinians who have the right to return to the lands they were forced to flee when Israel was created in 1948. As Netanyahu not repeatedly said that it should be consigned to oblivion, this factory of pleasure, ecstasis, is built on death instinct and fueled by fear of the other, which is consubstantial with the system of domination. Of course, those in power do not like the other, but above all, they fear them. One of the solutions to get rid of them is to create an enemy, whether internal or external, because by orchestrating their death and showing it live, it offers them another opportunity to reach the heights of pleasure. The dehumanization of body, considered not to belong to those who inhabit them, is not new. Was this not how the self-proclaimed discovered and the kingdom to which they belong resolve the question of a labor force that could be exploited by claiming that both the indigenous people and the Africans had no soul? It was then possible for the colonial power to uproot them from their continent, commit genocide against them, summarily executed them, and above all, consider them as a movable property with complete legal impunity. And this impunity is still in a place when there is case of black people or Arab people killed by police violence. Most of the time, the police get impunity. It's not new. This impunity against the right to life paves our history, particularly that of the former slave states. Today, with Supreme Court, Justice Roberts, Trump versus United States opinion, our world officially returned to the future. This judge, the Judge Roberts, offers the current occupant of the White House a presidential immunity from prosecution. This decision placed the President of the United States above the law and able to violate the principle of the rule of law, which states that no one is above the law. This confirms that immunity reads with impunity. To top off this incredible gift, which destroys the democratic rule of the North American nation, the same judge gives him control of the Department of Justice and the FBI, which translates to, and he said, Trump said, I have the right to do whatever I want. I am the president of the United States, and I run the country and the world, unquote. With Palestine, it is indeed the same paradigm of colonial domination of our body that is being implemented and supported by all the friends of this murderous state. They claim to be fighting against barbarism. They assure us that they are nothing but animals, Palestinians are nothing but animals. They impose endless displacement on them. They deprive them of any possibility of providing for their basic needs. And finally, they starve them. Nothing new beneath the blazing sun of imperial democracy, driven by a deadly capitalist system that decide who should live or die, while the media wants its false arguments to convince anyone who will listen that there is no alternative if we want to save the white world. Is this not how both slavery and the colonization that follow its abolition were justified? We have to ask if this event, which laid the foundation for the modernity doctrine, were not only possible by some papal bull, and particularly one of these papal bull authorized to reduce any Saracen or Muslim, pagan, or any other non-believer in Christianity to a condition of perpetual slavery. It was in the middle of the 15th century. We have to ask if there is some relation with the situation where we are now and what happened from the so-called discovery. And also there is another one also interesting. The second one, some years after, specifies this bull is called the Inter Caetera bull, saying the Pope of the moment said the king, and I quote, has justly and legitimately acquired and possesses this island, lands, port, and seas, and they are rightfully and belong to the said King Alfonso and his successor, unquote. We have to think about that. What mean exactly this quote in the etc. et caetera bull. This doctrine of discovery took off in 1492, and this system of predation with its management of the enslavement of millions of people, followed by its management of the newly freed from the beginning of abolition, and above all, by the management of a justice system based on race and class, allowed the liberal capitalist system to impoverish the people even further by creating the category of non-being, which Franz Fanon discussed in Black Skin, White Mass, particularly through the issue of the de-alienation of black people, I call de-alienation of black people, which implied an abrupt awareness of economic and social reality, and adding that the alienation of black people is not an individual issue. This is indeed a collective political issue that the system vehemently refused to treat as such, denying the politics of successive doctrine of colonization and colonialism, and reducing this choice and their consequences to anecdotes that claim to be history. In this regard, and for example, in France, yesterday, the former prime minister, very close to Macron, he was at the moment very close to Macron now. He is far from Macron, and even he is criticizing Macron, said colonialism was not a crime. Unquote. In this regard, there is one country that must hold this hegemonic and colonizing power to account, Haiti. Since its independence was won through struggle, including against France, the colonizer, the latter had the audacity to make Haiti pay the price for its liberation by imposing an illegal debt. And the illegal debt was paid until it was imposed in 1825, and the debt was paid until 1970. Then the United States occupied this first black republic and left with all the gold contained in Asian banks. But that was not enough. The former colonizer participated in the selection of president thanks to the role played by the institutionalization of gang in Asian politics, which encouraged corruption. The gang, we have to be very aware, the gang are not new. It's a system put in place by a former Asian president, but selected with the support of most of the time with the US. And it was for them to use the gang to be re-elected. It was for them the way to stay in place and to continue to apply the US politics and policy. This was an opportunity for the former colonizer to regain control of what they believed belonged to them. The liberation of Haiti was a mistake. It must return to the fault of the colonizer. The League of Nations and then the UN have always been the Trojan horse of the colonizer in the struggle for independence of countries aspiring to emancipation. We know what happened next. Even aid must be questioned. What does it mean to help a country like Haiti? For now, the UN is acting according to the wish of Haiti friends, the United States and the core group, who want the gang to end their murderous activity. Last August, the United States offered $5 million to anyone providing information leading to the arrest of Jimmy Cherizier, known as the Barbecue, a gang dealer. Even through the United States know full well that the weapons come from Florida. And US is the most important provider of guns to Haiti. The UN, for its part, has already included him in October 2022 in the brand new UN sanction regime against Haitian armed gang, travel ban, access freeze, targeted arms embargo, etc. What does this double standard say about our world when autocrats and genocidal leaders are free to move about as they please? The only thing that interests the friends of Haiti is control over what remains of the country's natural resources, just as they prefer this country to continue to be the hub of drugs trafficking between Colombia, United States, and Europe. Let us also remember the role played by this institution in the management of the earthquake with the importation of cholera by peacekeepers from Nepal. Although the UN acknowledged its responsibility, no compensation was given to the families of the 30,000 or so people who died. The ignominies are piling up, and the biggest victim, apart from the people, are the right of people to self-determination and political sovereignty. Of course, it is the international law and international humanitarian law who are totally delegitimized and destructurized. The financial system's only concern is to enforce the doctrine of law and order so that profit flow unhindered to share orders. Haiti is through the colonial world what Palestine is today's liberal world. Our world should understand that what can be inflicted on this sovereign country will be inflicted on others. The rule of hegemony based on the balance of power in international relations is deregulation, delegitimation, and destructuring. It goes without saying that one of the direct consequences of an internationally wrongful act is that all subjects of international law are under an obligation to make reparation. It's regarding the use of disproportionate use of violence when you attack a country. When you pretend to be attacked by a country, you can answer. It's reciprocity, but you have to answer at the same level than the aggressor did. Reparation, which consists of the obligation to eliminate the consequences of the internationally wrongful act, appears above all as a mechanism for sanctioning violation of international law. The principle of the obligation to make reparation is deeply rooted in international law. According to the Permanent Court of International Justice, I quote, "The essential principle which derives from the concept of unlaw or illicit act is that reparation must, as far as possible, eliminate all the consequences of the unlawful act and restore the situation which would probably have existed if the act had not been committed," unquote. But in this area, everything is also based on a notion of principle governed by the balance of power. Demanding reparation should be one of the elements ensuring the emancipation of people. It should be the common struggle of the force of change fighting against the coloniality of power that disregards both international and national law. The dignity of millions of people and the sovereignty of many peoples depends on it. Peoples, and particularly the Palestinian, can no longer tolerate their sovereignty being preempted by the defender of the liberal world order. Reparation as a means of putting an end to the perpetuation of a system of subjugation and exploitation, the model for which was imposed on many peoples of the South from discovery onwards, and which still permeates the relationship and relation imposed by modernity and Eurocentrism, whatever the level at which this occurs. Take the Caribbean and South America. In the case of farmers claiming land, states use the myth of citizen equality and right to mask the serious disparity created by enslavement and colonialism, while landowners acquire land through theft and crime, which went unpunished and outside the law. Impunity, still impunity. Reparation requires redefining the framework within which human rights can be shared and moving away from references to have led to crimes against humanity, genocide, theft, war, and the lies associated with them. It is therefore interesting to read, for example, just I mentioned very quickly when some years before the abolition, there were two states claiming their having their constitution, French and US, some years of difference. And what it is interesting, it is in their first article, France affirms the freedom and equality of rights among all citizens, which has already been guaranteed by the Declaration of the Right of Man and of the Citizen. But at the same time, millions of peoples have fallen by the wayside, enslaved. They were excluded from all rights, and it was on this second lie that the French nation was built. On the one hand, and on the other, its reputation as the birthplace of human rights, because these people from 1789 with this declaration was until 1848 a lot of French citizens were enslaved and not considered as human beings. And the second example, it is the Declaration of Independence of 1777 from US. And it emphasizes that, I quote, "We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," unquote. And we know how, since abolition in US and until end of segregation and until now, equality and unalienable rights are not for everybody, for every US citizen. However, the enslavement of all those who were already slaves neither ceased nor diminished between this declaration and the final abolition. And also, we have also to pay attention that at the moment of abolition, and particularly in France, there was in the act of decree of abolition in 1848, there was an article 5, saying in the next future, very soon, a law will decide the amount of money will be given to the slave owners. And of course, it's institutionalized. Black body become criminals, and the criminal becomes a victim because they receive money. And it's not the only country doing that. It was the same thing in Brazil and other states. Well beyond abolition, this ideology of domination persisted, and the United States then moved on the Jim Crow law, which established a new social order and a justice system that still does not punish crimes committed against young African Americans, thus organizing impunity for law enforcement and reinforcing structural racism, a common feature of all former colonizer countries. And even now, Michelle Alexander, it's a new Jim Crow, extended the metaphor of the Jim Crow law to mass incarceration as a means of controlling, monitoring, and punishing African Americans through mass imprisonment rather than cultural and social policy. And in our European country, we can see how the police violence is very close to this controlling and monitoring and punishing African and Arab bodies. I have to, okay. J'ai presque fini. Regarding also the dominant classes, the white classes completed the subjugation of the world by constructing, at the end of the Second World War, a discourse on human rights, morality and compassion, which gave rise to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Despite this instrument and the many others that followed, including the two international covenants of 1966, the red shirts have never ceased to be kept in structural alienation. Human rights function as a paradoxical injunction, and to this end, those in power know how to play on this injunction contained in the first article common to both international covenant, development, economic, social, and civil and political. This was necessary because after abolition, the Western world never wanted to question the inhuman aspect of the criminal society in which colonization, enslavement, and colonialism took place. They passionately refused to look at the inhumanity of their action, and with irresistible fervor, they did everything they could to hide their deadly thinking. The foundation of capitalism had to be saved by organizing impunity, inter alia. Thus, quite naturally, these two crimes continue through colonialism with the perpetration of equally serious crimes, which today take a new form in the guise of neocolonialism and liberalism, guaranteed by the financial system and the militarization of the world. For this reason, its treatment that should be universally applicable are nothing more than wishful thinking that allow structural violence and institutional racism to be authorized or justified, the only mean of maintaining control over the colonized and the wretched. Maybe. Just to finish, the plan for Gaza fantasized by the current occupants of the White House do not aim for hope for the future, declaring a desire for peace outside the framework of international law and disregarding the inalienable right of the Palestinian people, including self-determination and sovereignty, means perpetuating a colonial framework by establishing external control. And we know what institutional crisis this causes. One need only think of Haiti with a core group. Again, it also means denying self-determination and laying the groundwork for the next aggression organized by colonial state. There can be no peace without an end to colonial occupation and the restitution for all Palestinian lands stolen by the Israeli state, without the release of all political prisoners, without an end to the interference of donors in the international affairs of the state of Palestine, and without the exercise of the right of return for all Palestinians expelled since the Nakba. Okay, just to end, because it's long. And it's clear that this plan and those who conceive it believe that we should live life to the fullest right now and not worry about tomorrow or yesterday. As Franz Fanon pointed out, they are dangerous because they believe that each minute is separate from the minute that follow or precede it, and that they are the only ones on this earth. It is in this spirit that Franz Fanon called for collective commitment and responsibility. It is not a question of acting for the sake of acting, but of acting conscientiously in connection with others. I have been working with the Franz Fanon Foundation for 20 years. Franz Fanon is not just a psychiatric and researchers whose theoretical thinking can be used to support argument. He is a comrade in arms. We can incorporate him into our struggle to think about the future. Franz Fanon does not provide a model like Marxism. He offers a method pulling several threads at once, thinking in terms of action, bringing through into dialogues, deconstructing national narrative, questioning Eurocentric modernity, placing the black question and the legacy of the slave trade and forced Christianization back at the heart of the debate, and thinking of Africa as an indispensable element of the human world. Frantz Fanon invite us to repair crimes against humanity, when he urged us, and not when I say to repair, is not only through the process of reparation, but it is especially when he urges us to touch the other, love the other. It teaches us to rebuild human bonds where the West has learned to enjoy the elimination of the others. His project is that of a new world centered on the human, with the other, not against them. This is the new man he calls for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Muriel. Just to let everyone know where we're at in the program, we're going to continue directly with the next talk by Nelson Maldonado Torres, and then we'll have a short break, and then hear the response by Sara El-Groupesi. And I hope that we'll have time for a couple questions afterwards. So with that being said, thank you so much, Muriel, for your lecture. I'm going to introduce Nelson Maldonado Torres. Nelson is the co-chair, as has been mentioned, of the Frantz Fanon Foundation, and also the president emeritus of the Caribbean Philosophical Association. He's currently a professor at the University of Connecticut, and the author of a number of books, among others, Against War, Views from the Underside of Modernity. With that being said, please, a warm welcome for Nelson Maldonado Torres. Yeah, I can basically set it up right now.
Okay. Okay, leave it there, and then okay.
I'll just test the
Oh yes,
sound.
exactly. Put the volume. Does it work? Okay, no, stop it. Okay, perfect. Leave it there. Oh, put it, enlarge it. Okay, just click in the corner. Right. Perfect. Okay, let's see if the sound works. We'll see in a second. No. Don't.
Yeah, I just want to see the sound.
No. It won't sound like that. We will have to wait.
Okay.
Well, yeah, we'll have to, or put another, open another one in front.
Do that, yeah. It should work, though. I'm pretty sure that.
You think? Yeah, put it in. Okay, they leave it there.
I'll share it with.
Okay, we'll see. Hello. Is it working? Is it? Yes, thank you. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and Karna, her wonderful team, for bringing us, to Sara for accepting, responding to our presentations. This is really a pleasure to be here in Frankfurt again. It has been a while. And I wanted to start, acknowledging a point that I took from Mireille's presentation, which is this kind of dichotomy that we have in our thinking about the contemporary, right, that is so present. Well, on the one hand, let's say the hegemonic international order, including many Western states, or perhaps principally those Western states, including, of course, the US. On the one hand, pressuring hard to avoid recognizing anything like reparations, right? Anything, to completely kind of dismantle any kind of rhetorical or argumentative architecture or argumentative framework to make something like that legible, to undermine it, to the point that it cannot even be said, to the point where if you said it, you appear as irrational, right? Or as violent, even just for mentioning it. On the one hand, you find that very strongly, right? Resistance to anything like reparations, and then on the other hand, extremely quick to engage in disproportionate acts of violence, right? Both things simultaneously. And when you live in a world that is operating with that dynamic, with those rules, then you're living definitely in a maddening world, right? Where that is almost impossible to live in. And then, of course, part of the idea is that even in that maddening world of violence, multi-side violence, then you are expected, where there is disproportionate violence, just simply to stay there and die or try to live in that hell, right? Therefore, ending refugee status and so on, undermining the refugee status system. And then also, on the other hand, if it is in the interest of those states that you live because they want you to learn, then they want you to live, right? So we live then really in a world of damnation. And that's why, in a way, we keep reading Fanon today, even 100 years after his birth. And Mireille, in a way, I took most of her talk to be about the what. What are some of the topics in the contemporary world to which Fanon's work talks to us, or around which it is particularly relevant. And she ended bringing the notion, which is what I'm going to focus on, the how to go about it, right? How to go about it. Because I think that Fanon is proposing something that is, in terms of, let's say, knowledge production, creativity, engagement, that is very different from the position of the critic, even talking truth to power, as important and effective as that may be, or recognizing the limits, and the position of the intellectual. I think that he's bringing something else, and that something else, we in the foundation have been referring to it as kind of a combative attitude, right? As having to do with combat. And it has become the topic of the combative decoloniality has become particularly important for us. It has become important for us, particularly in a context when the notion of decoloniality and decolonization has spread through multiple liberal spaces, particularly in certain parts of the academy. And in the process, arguably, the comparative character has been stripped out of it, right? Sometimes lost, and it becomes a new field of studies. In some places, they call it decolonial studies, right? And when you hear decolonial studies, run through the door. Yeah. So I wanted to engage in a reflection on decoloniality, and particularly in combative decoloniality. Now, in 2021, the foundation, we were commemorating the 60th anniversary of Fanon's passing, of his death, and also the 60th anniversary of the publication of The Wretched of the Earth, right? And we invited various organizations in different parts of the world to join us, to think about what combative decoloniality is for them, right? And it's referring to the how do we come together to build a new world? How do we come together to not simply to preserve our sanity, but to make ourselves again in the process of opposition to the system that dominates us, are in the context of building linkages and bonds and connections among ourselves, people who were not supposed to even take seriously each other. And so I was going to put this video at the end, but I thought that it probably was a good also moment to put it at the beginning, because it's a performative political response to a question: what is combative decoloniality? To the question that we raised by a feminist collective in Puerto Rico. I am from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, right? Arguably perhaps the oldest colony of the modern world, never been anything like independent, right? We have been living with colonialism for a while, and still, of course, now directly under US colonialism. And so they have a response, and this is the response they have. Let's see if the audio works. We're hoping that it works. And so they introduce us to this notion of combative decoloniality through their eyes, and then we go to a reflection. And this is how they begin. This is the quote that they decided to start the program. And then just play, okay. Okay, you got it.
Y la violencia se manifiesta de muchas maneras. Abajo. Hacia personas de las comunidades. Sabemos que las cosas están empeorando. Y empeoran porque hay una crisis que trastoca y nos trastoca nuestros hogares, nuestros familiares, nuestras comunidades, trastoca nuestros centros de trabajo, que está enraizada en una crisis económica, que está enraizada en una crisis de desastres naturales, que está enraizada en una pandemia y que sí está enraizada en las maneras en las que llevamos tantos años sometidas a un coloniaje. Y esto no es hacer de una lucha o de una causa justa política, es saber que nos están asesinando por un asunto de poder, y cuando se habla de poder se tiene que hablar de política. Así es. Es así. Porque cuando aquí estamos, cuando salimos a la calle a protestar, cuando nos reunimos para proponer, estamos haciendo política. Y aquí se está construyendo poder, poder popular y colectivo. Y que nosotras y nosotros, la gente que está aquí, y la gente que está en sus casas viendo y apoyando, pero sobre todo la gente que está aquí poniendo el cuerpo en la calle, vamos a estar fiscalizando, vamos a estar exigiendo, y nosotras y nosotres no nos conformamos con el tiempo y la línea de tiempo que establecen allá. La urgencia la estamos estableciendo nosotras aquí. La Convoquemos, compañeras, compañeros y compañeros, convoquemos, movilicemos y hagamos nuestra esta lucha. Esta lucha es de quien ponga el cuerpo en la calle y organice. Así que de aquí salimos de la emergencia a lo que emerge, de la emergencia a lo que sale de abajo y recorre de la emergencia a lo que sí es posible. Y si estamos hartas, de verdad, si estamos hartas de las maneras en las que nos tratan, si estamos hartas de las maneras en las que nos acosan, que nos agreden, que nos abusan, si realmente estamos hartas, pues sí, vamos a quemar el cielo si es preciso.
The Colectiva Feminista en Construcción has been described as the most impactful non-partisan political organization in Puerto Rico, and arguably its work played a fundamental role in what later became the combative summer of 2019 in Puerto Rico, where massive protests to the island that summer led to the resignation of the governor. Now, I want to present to you some parts of a work under construction, which looks to the question of decolonial philosophy. What is decolonial philosophy? And the essay describes, I go through 3 steps from method and dialogue to combat, right? And I'm sort of relying on the work of the Argentinian-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel, who's been a prominent philosopher of liberation from Latin America. Well, I think we owe quite much, but I think that Fanon's work helped us to complement and extend some of Dussel's formulations in a way that ultimately leads to a vision of decolonization very much in the spirit of what you're seeing here. Right. Now, I will read the abstract of this so that the whole argument is clear and you can understand the different parts, right? When René Descartes wrote Discourse on Method, he sought to anchor philosophy in the search for a method that dispels skepticism without relying on faith. The emphasis on method helped to keep Christian epistemological pretensions in check, but did little to question the propagation of a new creed, Eurocentrism and its associated religion of whiteness, to use W.B. Du Bois's term. In response to the excesses and limits of Eurocentric philosophy, comparative and world philosophy emerged and focused on the relevance of dialogue rather than method for understanding philosophy. In the context of the catastrophe of modernity coloniality, one could argue, however, that the basic conditions for engaging in dialogue have been severely compromised. When dialogue takes the place of method, Eurocentrism may be questioned, but not so necessarily the liberal creed, to cite Sylvia Wynter, that became dominant, at least until recently, in the modern Western world. This is evident in the thematization of philosophy as traditions of inquiry, which can include decolonial philosophy as one such tradition. However, decolonial philosophy questions as much the primacy of method as that of dialogue, and it challenges the approach to different philosophies as traditions. Emerging within the catastrophe of modernity coloniality, decolonial philosophy may be best understood as dimensions of training in the practice of freedom, to cite the organizers and intellectual and theorists Natasha Dillon and Amin Hussain. Drawing from the philosophical practice of figures like Frank Fanon, but also Gloria Anzaldúa and others, it could be argued that decolonial philosophy is rooted in a combative decolonial attitude that finds expression in the formation of collectives, movements, and liberation fronts, whose actions foster otra vida, to cite the Colectiva Feminista en Construcción. Now, in the text entitled and an essay entitled Anti-Cartesian Meditations of 2008. Enrique Dussel argues that Hegel played a major role in positioning Descartes as the philosopher who starts, quote, the authentic philosophy of the modern age. A thesis that Dussel will seek to challenge in various ways. In Anti-Cartesian Meditations, Dussel stresses that Descartes' discourse on method should be understood in the context of a larger exploration of method through the 16th century philosophies of Jesuits, some of whom were Descartes' own teachers. Understood in this context made it easier to understand that Descartes' innovation involved, for Dussel, a metaphysical reductionism by taking mathematics as the dominant model to understand knowledge, and a conformity with solipsism, right, of the ego cogito, as a point of departure for thinking about the self, about knowledge, and about reality. It is from this point of view that epistemology can become then first philosophy, and that method is then taken as the distinctive mark of modern philosophizing. The ego cogito becomes the new paradigm of modernity, writes Dussel. Dussel hypothesizes that the Descartes' formulation of the ego cogito is not only indebted to Jesuit philosophers who pursued the question of method in the 16th century. Something else was taking place throughout the 16th century that helps to explain why European philosophers were willing to explore possibilities for thinking outside the bounds of the idea of cosmic and ontological order implied in the concept of the great chain of being towards subjectivity itself and a solipsistic I think as a point of departure. It was the so-called discovery of the New World. While Renaissance humanism had started a revaluation of the position of the human being in the metaphysical order of reality, it was arguably in the context of the so-called discovery where the notion of an ego that could become its own foundation became increasingly widespread through European culture. It is an I that discovers lands and peoples who were not otherwise mentioned or alluded to in the traditional and sacred scriptures. It is an I that needs to remap the world and to build new societies in lands that are thousands of miles away from the centers of political and religious authority. This is what leads Enrique Dussel to argue that the I conquer precedes and establishes a condition of possibility for the formulation and the spread of the I think as the indisputable start of modern philosophy. This is also why it should then not be strange that whether Descartes would approve it or not, ratio mathematica, epistemic rationalism, and subjectivity, now citing Dussel again, would then serve as foundation of the political domination of colonial, racialized, and feminine bodies. On this point, Dussel seemed close to a thesis defended by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, according to whom Descartes was the first philosopher to have systematically theorized, discussed, and elaborated the Christian dualism between the soul and the body, culminating in what Quijano refers to as the process of bourgeois secularization of Christian thought. Quijano argues that with Descartes, and I'm quoting Quijano at length for a moment, with Descartes, this is Quijano, the mutation of the ancient dualist approach to the body and the no-body took place, and the non-body took place. What was a permanent co-presence of both elements in each stage of human being, with Descartes became a radical separation between reason, subject, and body. Reason was not only a secularization of the idea of the soul in the theological sense, but a mutation into a new entity, the reason/subject, the only entity capable of rational knowledge. Without this objectification of the body as nature, its expulsion from the sphere of the spirit, the scientific theorization of the problem of race would have hardly been possible. From the Eurocentric perspective, certain races are condemned as inferior for not being rational subjects. They are objects of study, consequently bodies closer to nature. In a sense, they became dominable and exploitable, according to the myth of the state of nature and the chain of the civilizing process that culminates in European civilization. Some races, blacks, American Indians, or yellows, writes Quijano, are closer to nature than whites. It was only within this peculiar perspective that non-European peoples were considered as an object of knowledge and domination, exploitation by Europeans virtually to the end of the Second World War. This new and radical dualism, still quoting Quijano here, affected not only the racial relations of domination, but the older sexual relations of domination as well. Women, especially the women of inferior races, women of color, remain stereotyped together with the rest of the bodies, and their places was all the more inferior for their race, so that they were considered much closer to nature or directly within nature. It is probably that the new idea of gender has been elaborated after the new and radical dualism of the Eurocentric cognitive perspective in the articulation of the coloniality of power, close quote. And of course, this is a reflection that Maria Lugones extends in her work and in her work on decolonial feminism, right? Connects directly with this point, thinking gender within the modern colonial matrix of knowledge, power, and being. Now, Quijano's thesis is that this new dualism, now I'm not quoting Quijano anymore, is highly informed by and provided further legitimacy for the distinction between the colonizer as an active being and the colonized or inferior racialized subject. A new common sense emerged with the idea of human subjectivity as active essence responsible for discovery, control, and management with other beings, presumably human, and a vast flora and fauna that had appeared in the context of discovery and colonization as essentially passive beings and objects of knowledge. This paves the way for the emergence of a new dualism and for the new dualism's centrality in the further legitimization of colonial violence and environmental catastrophe. What we're basically saying is that these philosophical constructs play an important role in legitimating and creating and sustaining that kind of maddening world, maddening, right, making us mad, maddening world that I was describing at the beginning. Right? That the politics of that maddening world are clearly connected with philosophical principles and ideas about reality, ourselves as subjects, our bodies, other people that we take. And so this is part of the, let's say, the critical analysis of that makeup. Now, I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump a couple of paragraphs and continue with the problem with the reification of method in modern philosophy has less to do with a forgetfulness of being, obviously thinking about Heidegger, than with a forgetfulness of alterity and an indifference to systematic violence. It is also connected with a forgetfulness of the body, understood as what Frantz Fanon conceived as the open door of consciousness. That is Frantz Fanon's conception of the body. Becoming instead primarily an object of knowledge or an object of torture. The power of method as the prime indicator of legitimate knowledge should not be underestimated. If the body itself can turn into purely an object of knowledge in the philosophy of the ego cogito, how much so other dimensions of existence? And if everything is an object to a thinking being, then method is of the essence, because it is only through method that one can attain knowledge of the object in this view. Method allows the subject to rid themselves of contingent and inessential influences emanating from the social world and from the body. Method secures disciplines of knowledge. Again, this is according to the hegemonic view. In this way, method simultaneously secures the I think, the ego cogito, as the legitimate area for philosophical inquiry, and method itself as the means through which the subject can get to produce knowledge of the object. And of course, universities and research universities have been founded on that idea of the primacy of method. And the idea of you as students, right, to the extent that we are students at the university, we are supposed to be cultivating our rational capacities, right, as emanations of that ego cogito, let's say. Which points to the extent to which we are always already, even in things that seem to be disconnected from colonialism or racism, we are already shaped by racism and colonialism. Now, the price to pay for this reductionistic metaphysics is the inability to address systemic and systematic violence in modernity, including the unfolding of this violence into fascistic formations that end up spreading genocidal and colonial technologies of control into European empires and nation states themselves. Now, I want to shift from that critical analysis of method to the change to dialogue, right? How dialogue then began to acquire an important status in so-called word philosophy and comparative philosophies, right? And in a way, also referring to Dussel, who also in 2008, he wrote, make a presentation in the World Congress of Philosophy in Seoul, and it was entitled Rethinking the History of Philosophy and Comparative Philosophy. And in that presentation that has been published, I want to highlight a few elements of that presentation. First, Dussel questions the myth-philosophy binary, where myth is synonymous with irrational accounts of reality and philosophy refers to rational engagement with the world. Second, Dussel's insistence that the process of urbanization through the entire world was accompanied by the emergence of narratives with philosophical categories, and that these reflections included various criticisms of the hegemonic forms of power in those times, meaning that philosophy and critical thinking are spread throughout the world from a very early moment, and is not simply anchored in ancient Greece, for example. Now, Dussel also criticized the philosophical Eurocentrism and the supposed universality of the premises of European philosophy. Now, the emergence of a post-Eurocentric moment of, he calls it dialogue among philosophical traditions, right? That's what he's now pointing to. When we go beyond method and beyond Eurocentrism, that opens up the possibility of entering a new moment, a new historical period, even a period in the history of ideas or the history of philosophy, that allows and foments dialogue among philosophical traditions. Dussel believes that this project should likely start with North-South dialogues, given the existence of cultural and epistemic colonialism, right? Now, this North-South dialogue, as it happens, Dussel pursued that in a number of ways, and one of the most notable is a series of conversations that happened between him and Carl Otto Appel, some of which took place here in Frankfurt, and then I think at least one or two in Mexico. And there are publications of those kind of dialogues in the early 1990s, right? Particularly after, the context of the fall of the Soviet Union, suddenly a new horizon emerges. Oh, maybe a dialogue between the, Frankfurt School, a philosopher, an Latin American philosopher can happen, and that has been documented. But Dussel wrote and engaged multiple, from Jacques Derrida, Gianni Vattimo. He was all the time engaging the thinkers, critical Habermas, of course, and so on. And it's that because for him, that was very important, right? That's him, right? That North-South dialogue. But also followed then by a serious and permanent South-South dialogue, with the idea of defining the agenda of the most urgent philosophical problems in Africa, Asia, Latin America, or Eastern Europe, he writes. He writes that, quote, the rules of this dialogue should be formulated patiently, close quote. This should lead to training of a new generation of students of philosophy who are introduced to non-Eurocentric histories of philosophy in the first semester, to be followed by a second semester in the study of the great ontologies such as the Taoists, Confucianists, Hindu, Jainists, Buddhists, and Greek, thereby producing una nueva generación, a new generation that will think philosophically from a world horizon. That was his kind of program. So yes, the same should occur on courses in ethics, philosophy, ontology, anthropology, and he describes, he comments a sociology of philosophies by Randall Collins and so on, right? So he has that scope. Now, he also discusses not only this need of having breadth, right, in the world historical vision of philosophy, but also paying attention to critical or works that are critical of, he calls it el huracán de la modernidad, the hurricane of modernity. In my work, I call it the catastrophe of modernity coloniality. And he gives the example of Mohammed Abed al-Jabri in Morocco, and he discusses al-Jabri's critique of Arab reason and the Arab philosophical legacy. He outlines various steps in what he takes to be al-Jabri thinking. First, is demonstrating the value of Arab philosophy. Two, engaging in a critique of his own tradition. Three, a new creation a partir de la tradición propia, from his own tradition, alimentada por el diálogo con otras culturas, kind of cultivated or nourished by the dialogue with other cultures. And finally, that the dialogue of philosophers who belong to different traditions should be led by, quote, the creative and critical philosophers of every tradition. Meaning that it does not suffice being a philosopher who simply has mastery over a tradition. And it doesn't even suffice for you to be a philosopher who has mastery over global narratives. You also have to be committed critically against the huracán de la modernidad, right? The hurricane of modernity. And yet, what I am going to indicate that yet is falling kind of short from Fanon's combative vision. But Fanon's combative vision itself can be seen incorporating some of these elements. Right? Now, Dussel concludes the text by noting that in his proposal, then the philosophical traditions from the South can be put up to date with the interphilosophical dialogue, not only with Europe, but also with Latin America, India, China, or African philosophy, in the interest of developing a future pluriversal world philosophy that is also transmodern. Right? So that is his view for the philosophy, let's say, from between now and, I don't know, 200 or 300 years. I don't know, you know. Even with his vision, you know, how many generations it will take to get something like that. Now, in summary, Dusser's account, you know, he considered hegemonic modern Western philosophy that it has privileged method, right? And in that process affirmed a metaphysical reductionism that can be partly accounted for, and that it also contributed to the great catastrophe of modernity coloniality. That's point one. Point two, world philosophy demands a shift from method to dialogue. Then such dialogue requires critique, self-critique, and a fundamental concern with ethical and political issues that affect excluded and subordinated groups of human beings. That is, the dialogue in question is not merely a dialogue of philosophical elites who aim to simply demonstrate the philosophical worth of their traditions. Dussel points to his own philosophy of liberation as an example of the kind of critical theory that he believes should be part of the dialogical conception of world philosophy. Now, as it turns out, the idea of a new age in the history of philosophy was not new when Dussel wrote his presentation at the World Congress of Philosophy. Already in 1974, in his book on Method for a Philosophy of Liberation. And another part of the essay comments on this apparently irony. He's criticizing method in the European philosophy, but he writes a book entitled Method of a Liberation Philosophy. But my point is that almost 30 years later, he shifts to the question more openly to dialogue, right? But even in that book on method of a philosophy of liberation, he referred to the emergence of a fourth age of philosophy after the Greek, the medieval, the modern philosophy, by which he referred to his as analectic philosophy and so on. I'm going to jump that. And of course, in that early conception, it was still kind of linear. And to some extent, arguably, you can see some elements of Eurocentrism in that very vision, that he keeps working and working, right, and challenging, trying to present something else. Now, the theme of the liberation of the poor, because for the philosophy of liberation, insists on his philosophy of liberation took the concept of the poor as central, and then after his 1998 ethics, it was the concept of victim, and victim and poor became the kind of foundation for his philosophy of liberation. But when the liberation philosophy took the concept of the poor as the center, it was already part of the Latin American liberation theology, right? Which spoke about the preferential option for the poor, for those of you who are familiar with that literature. But Dusser's understanding of philosophy, including a commitment with liberation, was also found in other philosophies prior to his own philosophy, liberation philosophy. In Latin America, at least the most influential of this philosophy was found in Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961. And what Mireille is finding so interesting in the case of the southern cone of the, the hemispheres in the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in the southern part of Abya Yala, is that actually Fanon, one would think that if there was a potential in his thinking being further developed and taken seriously, would have been in places like Brazil, maybe Colombia. But there is a reason, and when I've been in Brazil, what I've been told is that, the question is, who controls what is published and what is translated, right? Who considers what is worth studying or reading or being printed, right? Who finances that? So all of that is mediated by racism as well. But then Fanon makes it to other contexts that where maybe his work would not be so much, would not be so explosive, right? It can enter into other places like Peru, like also Mexico, right? Like Argentina. And the generation of Latin American liberation philosophers in that moment in Argentina, and particularly Peru and Mexico, begin to read Fanon in the late 60s and early 70s. And some of them see in Fanon the maybe most distinguished representative of a new orientation in philosophy, So what I partly doing in my work is reconnecting with that voice, with that interpretation of Fanon, right? Because I think that partly what the philosophy of liberation did is contributed with much to our critical thinking of Eurocentrism and to our thinking of liberation. But on the other hand, it left some fundamental elements aside because Fanon was also left for view. In Dussell's case, Dussel took centrally two other figures, Bartolomé de las Casas, right, and Emmanuel Levinas. And in a way, there was a missed opportunity of not capturing those unique elements that Fanon was introducing to the question, and that makes the claim, the philosophy of liberation, even a more radical one. And so I will conclude the third part with this. Fanon contributes in several fundamental ways, but also challenges some dimensions of Dussell's work. To begin, he complicates Dussell's view of the other. Right? So of course, the position of the oppressed other is already, for Fanon, is already compromised. And that's why Fanon would not record to the category of the poor or the category of the victim. The main category, of course, for Fanon, if he of course refers to the black subject, to the black, but also to le damné, the condemned of the earth. And there is something very powerful in the concept of damné, because it is etymologically connected with the concept of donner in French, which is to give. So to be someone who is damned, condemned, which is the correct translation of, the wretched of the earth should be the condemned of the earth, le damné de la terre. And damné means someone who cannot give because what they have has been taken away from them. That means that for Fanon, that someone already is supposed to be participating in a kind of praxis of gift-giving and generosity and hospitality, and colonialism completely creates the world completely different and makes this subject, who is a giver, who is an open, generous, and hospitable being, it converts them in this system to the essence of evil. Right? It's a Manichaean reality, as something that needs to be persecuted, something that needs to be controlled, something that needs to be cleansed, eliminated, or abused, tortured, raped, right? That subject. So it creates that reality. And so that means that the voice of the other cannot be simply taken as the point of the voice. There is a certain dehumanization involves the obliteration of that subjectivity, right? So Fanon complicates also the issue of dialogue. A dialogue can take place between two selves, but decolonization is about restoring the possibilities of selfhood. Those of you who have read, I published in 2016 through the Frantz Fanon Foundation website, the outline of 10 theses on coloniality and decoloniality. And the outline of 10 theses are about, particularly thesis 6 to 10, about the restoration of the subject who has been obliterated and its emergence as a thinking, creative, interrogative being, and also a being that can engage in reality in the world. And then that emerges in thesis 10 as a collective subject. Those of you who had made it onto that point. And then initially, after I wrote it, the question was, well, why there is not a thesis 11, like in 11 thesis of Feuerbach, or be the 11 thesis of Fanon? But no, because the 11 thesis is, you're working with your collective group out there. You are there, right? You are doing what you saw the Colectiva doing. And that becomes itself a new platform for new ideas, new thinking, new creation, and so on, right? So it's not that you abandon thinking, it's that thinking then becomes collective. And it actually doesn't happen simply within the realm of an institution. It happens in the middle of different institutions, and it happens in communities. And so in the case of La Colectiva, they have now recently inaugurated, they have been for a while present in the center of the community and engaging both the state critically, but also engaging the community in Rio Piedras, in Puerto Rico. Impoverished area, massive gentrification, all of that. And they are building community, construyendo comunidad there, while also challenging the state. And building what kind of community? A community that is, opposed, counter to racism, to transphobia, to gender-based violence and all of that. And that's the work of decoloniality. And from there, again, new products emerge. That's the combative zone, I think that Fanon is talking about. And that element is the one I think that the liberation philosophy had yet to fully recognize. Fanon complicates thus the view of the intellectual and the so-called critic. He discusses the problems with intellectuals who engage in the critique of Eurocentrism or of imperialism, and who glorify the voices of the oppressed, but who themselves remain fundamentally disconnected from these collectives. So, to summarize, to conclude, the colonial philosophy, if we are to understand it as a combative, Fanonian kind of philosophy, is not simply the critique of Eurocentrism. And therefore not, and it is not even primarily an area of professional philosophy. Rather, it is both counter-catastrophic thinking wherever it takes place, from the kitchen to the bed, as maybe the comrades from the Colectiva would say. But first and foremost, the exercise of thinking within movements and collectives led and oriented by the myriad of constituencies who form the condemned of the earth. Finally, the provocative, as an area in professional philosophy, the colonial philosophy tends to drop its combative character and become the object of middle-class or aspiring middle-class subjects who claim expertise, even people of color. The only way in which the colonial philosophy can consistently be present in the academy is by interrupting the space of the liberal homo academicus and make of professional philosophy a satellite of living, a satellite rather than a center, of living combative thinking rather than the presumed center around which one can develop a discourse about philosophy, even about world philosophy. Likewise, the principal sites of decolonial philosophy are not panels of decolonial philosophy in professional organizations, but the encounters of movements and peoples that often take place through the global south. The encounters of peoples that include artists, professors, organizers, etc., rather than meetings of professional academics where they share their expertise with each other, and quite separate from the combatants who organize with others to think about power, knowledge, and change, and to act according to their convictions. They represent the sort of spaces where combative, these are the ones who represent the sort of spaces where combative decoloniality thrives. We're not talking about disciplines or even interdisciplinarity anymore, but about counter-catastrophic thinking and activity combined. For Fanon, the decolonization of the mind could not take place without the decolonization of the body schema. And this can only happen within collective movement for decolonization. And I want to, in that note, also applaud the work of the various organizations and collectives that are also joining part of this event and that have participated through the day. Right? Even the tour today is part of this decolonization of the body by taking, was actually a technique that also, there is a tradition, I think, in Palestine, taking people through the tour, guides to the sites, to show, to learn, to witness, and to learn and to be able to then think with them. In Fanon's work, to end, the philosopher is, properly understood, is and should be a combatant, and the combatant a philosopher. This is what takes place at the combative level of intellectual activity and decolonial struggle. In the combat zones, philosophy becomes a collective activity of and for actual liberation, rather than a professional exploration of authenticity and inauthenticity. I am referring to a drastic alteration in the meaning of philosophy within a catastrophic world, that maddening world that I was describing at the beginning. From philosophy as the love of knowledge to philosophy as the counter-catastrophic struggle for the creation of conditions where love and understanding can take place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nelson. We're going to do a really short break so that the people who want to can use the restroom, get some fresh air. We will continue in 5 minutes. Or let's continue in 10 minutes. Yeah, 10 minutes. 1:15.
Check, check.
So. Ups. So.
Ja, warte, darf ich?
Ja.
So, glaube ich. Probier's mal aus.
Hallo, hallo, hallo.
Geht doch, oder?
Es ist nicht so laut. Ah, doch. Und, okay.
Ja, no. Okay, then let's wait 1 minute. And,
Ja,
genau, Leila stellt dich vor und dann.
alles klar. Ich krieg's nicht rein.
Vielleicht kannst du es auch einfach nur hinlegen. Oder? Meinst du, es geht vielleicht? Das ist, glaube ich, lang genug.
Ja. Okay.
If you want, I think you can force people to.
I think everyone is gone.
Was that a test? Should I call them?
No.
It's good that you put this. Test, test. Ich kann frei reden.
Ja.
Just loudly say we're gonna. And then section.
Yes. Can you?
Do you want another bottle?
Okay, I think we're going to get started again. So I have the pleasure of introducing Sarah El-Bolbese. And Sarah works at the Institute for Near and Middle East Studies at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And prior to this, she was a research associate at the Orient Institute in Beirut. In her research, she examines questions of forced migration, trauma, and histories of first and second generation Palestinians in Germany. She's shown how Palestinian experiences of violence are erased in Germany, while Palestinian subjects are simultaneously demonized, deepening and reproducing their multiple displacements. In a recent publication, she describes her research question as being, what happens when the suffering of persecuted peoples or communities is tabooed? So it's my pleasure to hand over to Sarah for tonight's response.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leila. It's an honor for me to respond to you on the centenary of Frantz Fanon, whose legacy has inspired my thinking and practice. My work emerges from my experience as a Swiss Palestinian growing up in the German part of Switzerland and studying and working in Germany, contexts in which Palestinianness, its identity, history, and its ongoing exposure to Israeli settler colonial violence are rendered epistemically illegible. My research grew from a need to understand the pain carried across generations in my own family, marked by exile, silence, and the constant anticipation of punishment whenever Palestinianness became visible. In this sense, my research began as an inquiry into the psychic and structural dimensions of colonial violence and into the forms of repression that had shaped my community and me as well. The ongoing Nakba, the systematic expulsion and dispossession of Palestinians, is, despite being historically intertwined with the Holocaust and in part a direct consequence of it, excluded from post-Holocaust collective memory. The connection to National Socialism is only ever built one-sidedly in the representation of Israel as a safe haven for Jews. The Palestinian experience of violence is not linked to Israel's self-conception as a Jewish state. Moreover, it is made taboo. When made visible, it is reflected as something threatening, as something that competes with the Holocaust and contaminates the post-Holocaust culture of remembrance. The depiction of the Holocaust and the Nakba as antagonistic prevents the violence against Palestinians from being seen as a continuation of European anti-Semitism. The tabooization of Israeli settler colonial violence enables post-Holocaust societies to construct a renewed moral identity that conceals their ongoing entanglement with racialized and eliminatory violence. The taboo of the Palestinian experience of violence is so powerful that not only it, but Palestinians per se become something socially rejected. The Palestinian experience of settler colonialism is so scandalously close to the Jewish experience of National Socialism that sometimes one cannot even pronounce the word Palestine. Traces of this fear of Palestinian visibility can be found in the representation of Palestinianness as deviating from the moral norm, as one-sided, controversial, ideological, radical, violent, and riddled with anti-Semitism. In my book Tabu, Trauma und Identität, Subjektkonstruktion von PalästinenserInnen in Deutschland und in der Schweiz, 1960 bis 2015, in my book Taboo, Trauma and Identity, Subject Constructions of Palestinians in Germany and Switzerland, 1960 to 2015, I explored how the epistemic erasure of Palestinianness and Israeli settler colonialism continues the settler colonial project in exile, how it shapes Palestinian first and second generation subjectivities, intergenerational relations, and everyday life in Germany and Switzerland. I demonstrate how epistemic erasure repeats and deepens the naked violence of ethnic cleansing, producing a traumatic experience marked by melancholia, the dissolution of the self, feelings of invisibility and absence, guilt and shame on the inside, and self-negation on the outside. Yet I also document an emerging generational transformation, a movement from self-negation to visibility, and from isolation to collective action. While the first generation remains caught in their trauma, their children begin to transform it into agency, reclaiming the socially discarded identity and history, and replacing self-negation with a politics of visibility. To research the erasure that structure both subjectivity and academic as well as public debate required a method capable of addressing what remains unspoken. Psychoanalysis offered such a language, one that makes visible the effective economies of repression and the psychic and social life of coloniality. It enabled me to explore how colonial violence is not only enacted externally, but also internalized, and how these imprints can be transformed into knowledge. Choosing psychoanalysis meant confronting yet another taboo. Psychoanalysis is a subversive practice of knowledge production, one that remains marginal within contemporary academia, perhaps precisely because it unsettles the power structures on which institutional knowledge rests. It exposes how denial, projection, and repression operate not only within individuals, but also within collective and institutional life. Psychoanalysis offered me a method and a vocabulary for exploring taboo and trauma. Both phenomena operate by definition beyond what is narratable and within silence. They surface in relationships and ruptures, in affects, slips of the tongue, and associative sequences. Psychoanalysis has dedicated itself to the challenge of finding a language for what actually occurs beyond language, but also a language for suffering from social norms, as well as for the pain that does not conform to the norm. An important contribution of psychoanalysis thus lies in its examination of forms of structural violence. In clinical psychological trauma research, trauma is predominantly described through the narrow clinical concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. This discourse generally begins with an individual who is traumatized by a single identifiable event that is said to cause PTSD. Structural forms of violence are less accounted for in this definition. Psychoanalytic literature instead shifts the focus away from the single crisis-like event to the traumatic dimension of systemic violence and to the transmission of traumatic experience across generations. Pioneering studies nonetheless address trauma primarily in the context of the Holocaust. Other points of reference remain largely absent. The fact that colonialism is rarely perceived as traumatizing can be attributed to the neglect of colonial history and colonial racism. An exception is Frantz Fanon's writing. In his works Peau Noire Masque Blanc et Les Damnés de la Terre, he reflected on trauma in the context of colonialism and racism and traced the effects of French colonial repression on the psyche of Algerians. In the Palestinian context in German-speaking Europe, the structural nature of trauma becomes visible through symbolic violence, discursive and institutional practices that normalize or justify harm and thus reproduce the psychic wounds Fanon described. Such violence legitimizes expulsion and dispossession by denying and trivializing it, framing it as accidental or self-inflicted, or erasing it through negating Palestinians' historical presence and connection to the land. It is further sustained through a victim-perpetrator inversion that casts Palestinians as aggressors and moral deviants, contrasted with Israel's positioning within a Judeo-Christian Western civilizational community of values. These representations have long operated alongside practices of criminalization, such as surveillance, censorship, deportations, ban on assemblies, and the dissolution of student networks. As a result, the violence inflicted on Palestinians comes to appear legitimate, even necessary. Palestinians are thus rendered as subjects who deserve to suffer violence. Many, particularly those of the first generation, internalized these representations. They came to regard the violence they had endured as shameful, even self-inflicted. In this sense, they were dispossessed not only of land and history, but also of their own experience of violence. Symbolic violence reiterated and intensified the physical violence of expulsion, ultimately desubjectifying them, as I claim. Since both symbolic and naked violence, that is the violence of often multiple displacements, can be considered parts of the systemic violence of settler colonialism, I refer to Fanon's trauma phrase to describe the anguish of first-generation Palestinians in Germany and Switzerland. Of colonial racism, Fanon said that it inflicted a wound on the psyche. He describes this wound as both an event and a structure. It is caused by colonial processes of racialization, whereby the psyche is crushed by the insignificance ascribed to it. Fanon calls this the violence, the colonial regime's mutilation of the colonized person. The suppression of Palestinians in Germany and Switzerland engendered a fear of visibility and political activism, but also a fear of feeling, let alone expressing anger and mourning. Actors were unable to mourn their experience of violence because there is no social space for it. This resulted in melancholia as well as withdrawal from society, family, and other Palestinians, and ultimately in isolation. It resulted in social dying and suicidal living. Guilt and shame dissolved them as subjects. Locating the reason for dehumanizing violence in oneself, one interlocutor told me, "You know that in contrast to Jews, whom people are so concerned about, Palestinians have not succeeded in being viewed as human beings." Interlocutors often used derogatory language when speaking about themselves, like, I am a shitty Palestinian. Moreover, they had come to see themselves as threatening over time. Someone commented on his cautious way of communicating by saying that he has always tried to avoid emotional speech. Emotionality was interpreted as aggressive, he says, and one would often end up being pigeonholed as the aggressive Palestinian. Multiple displacement and subsequent suppression in Germany and Switzerland not only desubjectified first-generation Palestinians, but also became a significant factor in their relationships with their children. The relationship between the first and second generation was characterized by the melancholy of the first generation. Their sense of insignificance and invisibility was inscribed as emotional absence in their relationship with their children. In order to relate, they had to reestablish their parents as subjects. I argue that this contributed significantly to how the trauma of race was passed on to them intergenerationally. Parents and children reversed social roles. The effects of this role reversal manifest themselves in the habit of the second generation to merge with their parents, to absorb their trauma, and to secure social recognition for them, thereby restoring their emotional presence. In doing so, children relived their parents' pain. One second-generation Palestinian details her agonizing struggles with being unable to preserve her father's history of expulsion during his lifetime. The narrator's account blurs her own feelings with those of her father. I quote, "Yes, I actually always wanted to record his life story. When I asked him to write it down for me, he told me, no, it was too painful a story. So I was always afraid that one day it would be too late, and now these fears have come true. Now we just have stories, and of course I also have memories of it, but they are just memories. I'm just afraid that over time they will become memories of memories. And you no longer know what was really said, and I don't know if I can forgive myself. I don't want to presume now to say that I suffered as much as he did, but it has not been separable somehow. It concerns me in the same way. Sometimes I have had the feeling as if I feel the pain one-to-one, the pain in its purest form." Quote end. Many, both first and second generation, began to deny or conceal their identity in the public sphere in order to avoid the pain of being socially stigmatized instead of being seen as grievable human beings. A conversation with a second generation Palestinian shows the double lives this led to. I quote, "Nobody talks about it. You don't hear it in history classes. I never heard it in school. Our history must not exist in the history of the world. But it is not invented or wishful thinking. It really happened. And most people just don't want to believe it. Most people simply still want to hold on to the version the country was empty, which is not true at all. It hasn't been like that, and I don't understand why you can't talk about that. You always have to pay attention. Whether it's at school, whether it's at work, you have to be careful that you don't somehow put your foot in your mouth. You always have to, as a Palestinian, you have to negate yourself. Okay, so that our life goes on normally out here, maybe outwardly you go along with it. But I think inwardly, especially in the circle of the family, you don't have to go along with it. And for me, it's clear that if I ever have children in my life, that will also be passed on. That's not a question for me. Even my classmates didn't know that I was Palestinian, and that's how I grew up, quote end. The Israeli military offensive in Gaza in 2014 marked a turning point for many, especially second-generation Palestinians. The tabooing and justification of Palestinian experiences of violence increased with the Israeli military offensive. The disproportionate use of force by the Israeli army, which led to the killing of thousands of civilians, was presented as necessary, and Israel's narrative of a war of self-defense was adopted without reservation. Palestinians who protested against this disappeared as human beings in the representation of an anti-Semitic Palestinian collective subject. While many second-generation Palestinians had previously excused the lack of empathy towards Palestinians with ignorance or guilt towards Jews, they now interpreted it as anti-Palestinian racism. These increased feelings of mistrust towards the society in which they had grown up, and feelings of living in exile in the land of their childhood. Boundaries between here and there, Germany, Switzerland, and Palestine, became increasingly blurred for them and were effectively dissolved. They started to see themselves as being subject to a similar violence to Palestinians in historic Palestine. Second-generation Palestinians said again and again that they felt as if they are there. They increasingly felt as part of a transnational Palestinian identity, embedded their experiences with those of Palestinians there, and established a narrative of transnational repression. The fact that second-generation Palestinians articulated themselves as a group affected by systemic racializing violence, the fact that they were not willing anymore to apologize for attitudes that denied their experience of violence, marked the beginning of the end of their identification with the hegemonic discourses and the moral self-representation of the society in which they had grown up. It marked also the beginning of a process of self-humanization. They broke with the self-negation that had often been imposed on them by their parents, overcame their isolation and fear of visibility and activism. They discovered the grief and the anger that their parents were denied, began to reappropriate their socially rejected history and identity, began to transform guilt and shame into pride, and the powerlessness of traumatic existence into agency. They networked nationally and transnationally, organized themselves in anti-racist and anti-colonial groups, and worked against fragmentation. This generational shift has intensified since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza and post-Holocaust countries' military and moral support for it. In German and Swiss politics and media, the genocide was framed as a war against anti-Semitism, an accusation increasingly extended to Palestinians and their allies. Symbolic violence has become further institutionalized, especially in Germany, producing state-driven restrictions on Palestinian visibility and growing police repression. Drawing on Frantz Fanon, I described the generational transformation from self-suppression to self-humanization as a process of affective and mental decolonization, as a process of reappropriating the self and re-establishing self-ownership. For Fanon, decolonization is a struggle to reclaim oneself, to wrest subjectivity back from the structures that negate it. My research was not merely descriptive of this transformation, it was part of it. Some of my interlocutors cried when they realized, in relation to me as a listener, that their experiences were valuable, that they were recognized as human beings whose lives were not disposable. Some recognized their own histories for the first time as they narrated them and felt, often with surprise, seen. They came to recognize their experiences not only as meaningful, but as part of a collective history. What had long circulated as private, isolated, and isolating pain became part of a collective knowledge that could finally be articulated, shared, and even physically held. Some came to me with my book in their hands, saying it sat on their shelves at home and referring to it as their family book. It offered them a concrete manifestation of feelings and experiences that had long remained repressed. For such repression had effectively been required in order to be accepted by the society in which they lived. Through this, I witnessed the relational force of this research, how making erased experiences and feelings intelligible can restore connection, where erasure had produced rupture from oneself, from one's community, and from the world. The erasure of Palestinian experience had created deep cleavages across all these dimensions. Narrating what was silenced began to repair them. And crucially, this transformed me as well, because the same relational dynamic extended to me. Through researching and writing and engaging in conversations with my interlocutors, I was able to re-enter relation with the world again. In this sense, my way of producing knowledge did what Fanon understands as decolonial practice. It treated decoloniality not as a performative academic exercise, but as a part of a broader practice of liberation. Exposing the psychic imprints of coloniality meant reclaiming affect as a site of resistance and countering the epistemic and affective fragmentation imposed by coloniality. Doing this work from within academic institutions of the global north meant practicing decoloniality under conditions that mirrored the very colonial dynamics I was studying. Researching and speaking as a Palestinian on Palestine and settler colonial violence in German-speaking Europe entails reenacting the dynamics of erasure one analyzes. Knowledge production thus becomes inseparable from resisting the structures that seek to silence or delegitimize it, unsettling institutional racism, exposing the epistemic regimes that sustain it, and confronting the order that determines whose knowledge is recognized and whose histories are disqualified. Attempts to narrate Palestinian experience or analyze Israeli state violence are routinely met with censorship, accusations of anti-Semitism, and various forms of institutional discipline. My academic trajectory unfolded precisely under these pressures. Lectures cancelled, talks boycotted, texts censored. Defamatory interventions followed as soon as my research entered public debate. And my legitimacy as a scholar was continually questioned on the grounds of being too close to my topic. an accusation never leveled against German scholars working on National Socialism. What is framed as neutrality secures whiteness as the epistemic norm, while Palestinians are cast as morally deviant subjects whose speech must be disciplined. The very institutions that demand objectivity reproduce a regime of compulsory Zionism, regulating not only what may be said, but who is permitted to say it. It is under these conditions that the work of combative decoloniality takes shape. Working in such environments demands both mental and affective labor. It requires making oneself visible in spaces that demand one's silence. It means resisting projections that cast Palestinian presence as illegitimate or threatening, and transforming these affects into knowledge rather than allowing them to become mechanisms of self-erasure. This labor involves undoing the internalized negation of oneself as a subject, enduring the shame that comes with visibility, and resisting a racialized representational regime that positions Palestinianness outside the moral norm. One must endure and refuse to experience oneself as disturbing the social order and the internalized anticipation of sanction simply by speaking. Decolonial practice therefore becomes a form of continuous affective resistance, resisting self-censorship and the pressure to conform to what the surrounding environment wishes to hear. A pressure often heightened by the sense of gratitude for being invited to speak at all, a gratitude shaped by structural silencing. Yet such invitations are not always free of instrumentalization. At times one is included as the token Palestinian, especially when a lecture series on Palestine-Israel features only German or Swiss speakers. At other times one finds oneself reassuring organizers who caution one before a panel to not be emotional and to respect the opinions of others during the Q&A, as if one were about to bring the Kalashnikov to the talk. Yet it is Palestinians who have learned to navigate antagonism and heterogeneous discourses, skills that those protected by institutional consensus have rarely needed to acquire. The effective labor of doing decolonial work therefore also involves mirroring these dynamics back, making visible to institutional actors how they produce a culture of conformism, police speech, and restrict heterogeneity under the guise of civility. It means exposing this economy of fear without reproducing it. Practicing decoloniality from within such structures also means bearing frustration, being placed alongside someone who reiterates hegemonic narratives in order to neutralize one's presence. One must learn instead to unsettle such maneuvers. This too is effective labor, transforming disappointment and bitterness into endurance and resistance. Yet even when one manages to maintain one's positionality in such a setting, the emotional aftermath persists. Constantly navigating asymmetry and institutional disciplining often turns inward as self-doubt and guilt. Guilt for not having said more, shaped by the acute sense of responsibility for the ones suffering in historic Palestine. At the same time, voices within one's own community caution against engaging with white institutions, academia, or the media, warning that they will only use you. This too must be endured and rejected. resisting internalized disillusionment and cynicism, resisting the sense of being a puppet, resisting the pull to withdraw from spaces of authority, and refusing to reproduce the violent binary of us versus them. This is also effective anti-colonial labor, to remain aware of one's marginalization and still continue to engage, to believe, despite hostility, that change is possible. Decolonial work becomes the practice of sustaining faith in relation, even when institutions repeatedly threaten to extinguish it. Decolonial work in this sense is not only a critique of coloniality, but also the ongoing labor of unlearning one's own internalized subjection. It entails transforming shame, imposed anxiety, and the pressure to conform into knowledge about power and into resistance. Knowledge production can be liberating when it remains subversive, resisting its conversion into symbolic capital, career advancement, or institutional reproduction of hegemonic narratives. My own research followed this understanding of knowledge as liberation. Refusing merely to reproduce hegemonic and colonial knowledge and daring instead to ask questions that were not trendy, not supported by the field, but emerged from another experience and locus of knowing. This refusal to conform to disciplinary expectations was itself a decolonial gesture, unsettling what counts as legitimate research and who is authorized to undertake it.
Okay, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your talk. We don't have that much time left, unfortunately. So what I would suggest is that you can take a seat if you like. What I would suggest is that we have maybe 2 or 3 questions, and I'll ask that if you have a question, to please try to bring it up as briefly as possible. I'll give you these microphones. You just have to turn them on. Yeah, and I'll come to you with a microphone.
First of all, thank you very much, each and every one of you. I'll keep it brief. I have a question for Mireille Fanon Mendes. I have an understanding that in international law, when the concept of genocide was introduced into law, it was also there's also a law that says that no one can be tried retroactively. I'm so sorry. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this law came to be, that you cannot be tried retroactively if it has something to do with the genocidal aspect of the law? I don't know if I expressed myself clearly, but yeah. I pass it to my brother first?
Thank you. So, I mean, thank you for your talks. I mean, I really enjoy it. I have a question for, I think, for Professor from Connecticut, basically. I just want to understand, when you presented the talk about the decoloniality and right now I noticed that, okay, some people also related to that topic try to say that, okay, we cannot work anymore with Western books, like Miolo, for example. And I just want to, my question will be, okay, do you think it's really realistic? Because at the end of the day, those people also did, like, they did the PhDs also in Western countries and everything. Is it really realistic when we are talking about, or maybe, because I was thinking maybe it will be the last step of the decolonial theory. Maybe we are still in this dialogical, like, level, maybe, and what's your position about that? Because I know that you deal a lot with Western philosophy, and I also noticed last time you were like, I saw something like phenomenological epoche or something like that. It was quite interesting. So what's your opinion about that?
Thank you so much for these three, I think, very different and very complementary presentations. I would like to ask all of you on the panel if you could give us experiences of how you are trying to embody or to enact the change that we, I think, all have this understanding at the academic level, at the level of method, knowledge, etc. But I think that it's quite different when you are trying to embody something. And I think that especially, I mean, I'm saying this because I think that making a reflection that there's not enough black people in this room, I think needs to be followed up with why is that? And why are we in institutions and currently constantly find ourselves in institutions that remain to be anti-black, remain patriarchal, even in our organizing. And I would like to say that I think we all, at a level of understand that we need to be more like the Colectivo Feminista en Construcción. But we are not that, actually. And I think that I would like to have this conversation, and I don't know where to have it. And I think that the university, excludes all of these people that I would want to have this conversation with. Why are we, or how do we get out of this constant reproduction of hierarchies in the way we work? So it doesn't have to be activism. It doesn't have to be on the streets. Like, how do we embody this knowledge? How do we access it in our bodies? And I think that Sarah's comment on this shared experience and the shared engagement and struggle that makes being Palestinian a political identity, and the way that being Haitian is a political identity. Not only, this national racial construct. There's a question mark there. How do we make that something that we enact?
Thank you so much. And I have one question, but also one comment. The first, I agree with you, Alida. I think it is really important to talk about how in our institutions are normalized all what you talk about. And I think it's not only in the institutions, it's also outside of the institutions. And my question is, because of these internalizations of power, because I think I can see not only here, but I think it is good to talk about this because the people can discover this is not comfortable, because it's like you put a mirror to the people because you must know what means power, what means control. And I think for some people, maybe it's not so comfortable to put these kinds of questions, what means whiteness, what means power, who have the control, and how we can also, in our label, from community, etc., to deconstruct this, because I think it's not only in the institutions what happened. And my question for all of us is, for all of you is, especially because Fanon also say we must take care about of all of these theories, because sometimes can take also westernized institutions or westernized groups or westernized, yeah, they have a control, and they take these tools and take again for them and to use this again what we want to decolonize. And I think also this is my question, and this third thing I want to say is, I think it's also important to talk about, how do you say, also who is the subject, is considered the subject of knowledge. Because I think if we don't start to understand each other, understand our struggles, and to talk together, I think we cannot also finish this, or we cannot start to decolonize. And I think it's important to have these kinds of discussions, and maybe also to put out and to talk about what happened with experience, because we can see that, like also Fanon say, colonization is violence, and if the people are part of the control of this continuity of institutions or outside or in other places, I think it's good the people are uncomfortable with this kind of talk also. Thank you.
+9. So we have 10 minutes and we will take these questions and do a round of answers and responses. And tomorrow is the master class from 10 to 12 with Nelson and also Sarah. So there will be also a chance to go more into the discussion. So I pass it first to Sarah. No, okay. Nelson.
Mireille.
No, please.
Also, I am the only man in there. My voice has to be represented. No, please, because we are going to have more time tomorrow, but it would be important if you say something.
I don't really understand your question about retroactivity. Because I did not mention that. You mean in terms of genocide, if you want to sue someone for genocide? There is, yes, but concerning Palestine, retroactivity does not work. That's why I don't understand exactly. Yes. For example, enslavement. Okay. That true ratione temporis does not work, but for one reason. It's the question you raised is very interesting, because if you are thinking in a decolonial way, do we accept the rule imposed by white supremacy on law? Do we accept the positive way they understand law? When they said, law is law. No, law is not law. Law could be law, but law could be also the law understood by the people, because their need and the need of justice did not coincide with the need of domination put in place via law. And we have to understand law has to be arm for people, arm of social change. And for example, if regarding your question on retroactivity, and enslavement, particularly enslavement, because right now it's in the middle of nowhere, and there is a willing of reparation, but in a so different way, and sometimes it's more in a liberal approach than social change. And I don't want to think about the individual liberal way. I think it's really terrible. But retroactivity in this kind of question, that's true. With the Nuremberg Tribunal, and we are in Germany, with the Nuremberg Tribunal, those who put in place this tribunal put something as a rule, very interesting and very dominant, very imperialist way, because they said all crimes against humanity, all genocide committed before Nuremberg Tribunal will not be taken in consideration, never. Therefore, you put in a hole, a black hole, all crimes against humanity, crimes, genocide, crimes, war crimes, and other crimes, rape, etc., committed between the beginning of discovery, what we call discovery, what they call discovery, and the Nuremberg Tribunal. It means centuries of crimes. And saying that's right, they put in place the concept, if we can say that, of ratione temporis. And therefore, we could not get any justice. It is a perfect example of denied of justice. And what it is interesting, if you see, and I know there is a murder by police violence, even in Germany and in France and Europe, and in the case, there is no justice, because in certain way, what it was decided for black bodies and now for Arab bodies is still applied. It's like the recall or the justice recall, okay, oh yes, no crimes before Nuremberg Tribunal could be. And they apply the same logic, the same dominant logic, because we are still face an institutional racism. And if there is something to do with reparation, the only reason for what we need reparation is just to tackle definitely the issue of institutional racism. Otherwise, we are just repeating, and they will allow them. I used to say to the people claiming for individual reparation, I say, okay, you will get money. But if tomorrow you are victim of a new aggression of institutional racism, are you going to claim justice? And of course, the justice will tell you, but you got money. Now shut up.
I need to say we only have 1 minute left. Oh, I don't know. No, don't worry. I was.
I'm not there tomorrow. That's right.
Yeah, of course. No. I mean, we could do a last round, but I think then we will go over time. And we have tomorrow the master class, so you might be also all a bit tired by now and hungry. And so thank you for your patience also, and that you stay here until the end. And thank you, Mireille and Nelson and Sarah, for your incredible inputs that make us do a lot of reflections and thinking of the contemporary, and that we need to go on with the discussion. So thank you very much.
Let me just make sure that it's safe or something, right? Yeah.